Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on global climate compensation. It is based on a lecture I gave roughly a week ago at the International Summer School on Sustainability in Karlsruhe, and I've chosen to give it the title "We Need to Stop Ignoring the Obvious," because, as I hope to convince you, the solution to the climate crisis is actually obvious, which does not mean that it is simple, because we need to get a lot of people to work together. Nonetheless, I claim that this is an optimistic lecture because I am going to tell you what we could do to fix the most challenging problem humanity is facing today. Anyway, before doing so, let's start with the state of the world. Can we get serious now? This picture is, I copied that from The Economist. It's from Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, May 2024. Unprecedented flooding, lots of damage to property and human lives. Now, okay, things like that happen. However, here is a very recent picture, I think from yesterday or something, or even from today, from Czechia, Europe, Central Europe, September 2024. Different continents, different latitudes, but the problem is basically the same. So it looks like we are facing a worldwide kind of crisis here, and you don't even need climate scientists to tell us this anymore. It's obvious to the naked eye. So why is this happening? One of the plots I really enjoy or like to show is something I started many years ago, I think now 13 years ago or something. It's the so-called Keeling curve, and for most of you might probably know about it or have heard about it. So the blue oscillating curve here shows the carbon dioxide concentration measured in the Earth's atmosphere. The data are publicly available. If you go to this link, you can find them and download them, and then you can basically recreate this plot if you want to. I update this regularly, so you see here the date up here. The latest data are from the last day of August this year. We have now reached a carbon concentration of 424 ppm according to the measurement. Now this is a lot. Before the Industrial Revolution, these measurements started in 1958, and before the Industrial Revolution, we know that the concentrations were roughly 280 part per million. So that's unit part per million. Now we are at 420. So if you do the math, you see that the concentration has increased by more than 50%. Which means that every third carbon dioxide molecule in the atmosphere is now of human origin or has been put there by us. So when I was a student, when I started to study physics, people were still talking, this was in 1986, in those days people were still talking about 350 parts per million as like the upper limit. And then but you see, it has continued to increase. The dashed line here is a polynomial fit. It's actually an excellent fit, and it allows me to compute the derivatives, i.e. the slope of this curve, and even it's actually obvious to the naked eye that this curve is not only oscillating and rising, it's actually bending upwards. And if you look at the slope in the 1960s, early 1960s, the carbon dioxide concentration increased by less than 1 ppm per year. Today, after decades of climate debates and conferences, etc., it is now increasing 3 times faster. And I typically, to make this point clear, I typically tell my students we are actually driving toward a wall and we are still accelerating. And any suggestion that at some point it might be a good idea to remove a foot from the accelerator is considered a very radical idea, and the suggestion that we should actually apply the brakes at some point is considered completely out of the question. I have allowed myself, I know that not all climate scientists would agree with these lines, but I honestly don't really care, because here is a line. This is roughly the limit for 1.5 degrees warming, but there are two reasons why I don't care too much about where this line is. First, there are actually significant error bars in the climate predictions, and secondly, as I told you, the problem is not that the issue is not exactly where this line is located. The issue is that we are still accelerating. So wherever we put this line, if I were to move it up by 10 ppm, it would buy us another 2 years or something, or 3 years. So that's completely irrelevant. So we see this is a 1.5 degree limit, and we are obviously not going to be able to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. Here's a 2 degree limit, and if you look at any serious reporting like the United Nations emission gaps report, you realize that we are not on track for staying below this limit either. The world is currently heading for 2.9 degrees of warming or something. And what I also would like to point out, here I put in the dates of various conferences. Well, this wasn't a climate conference. Nonetheless, this was a United Nations conference on the environment, 1972. This was actually the year when Limits to Growth was published. Then we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992, where basically the nations of the world decided to stabilize the carbon dioxide concentration. We had the Kyoto Protocol, we had the Paris Agreement, we had the climate strikes, Fridays for Future, we had the COP28, and none of these conferences have had any impact on this trend. So what is the problem? The problem is very simple, and you should never run a combustion engine indoors. And yet that is exactly what we're doing. I have allowed myself to put in these reactions here, and these are the combustion reactions that are basically running the world today. So we have the combustion of coal up here. We have the combustion of what I call gas here, I mean natural gas, so this is methane. We have the combustion of petrol, which I now represent by octane, and we have glucose. Now, which is what humans are doing, basically burning glucose. Now, the point with these reactions, there are 2 points that are important here. First, in all of these reactions, if you want, let's start with the coal because this is simpler. If you want to burn 1 ton of coal, you need 2.7 tons of oxygen, and you produce 3.7 tons of carbon dioxide. This is of course the reason why fossil fuels are so popular, because you take most of the energy from the atmosphere, and you don't pay for that. So no wonder it's useful. If you actually would have to buy a tank of oxygen every time you buy coal, it would not be that useful. And of course the same thing with the waste you produce. You produce a whole lot of carbon dioxide, and this is just released into the atmosphere. The same goes for the other reactions with slightly different ratios between the masses. If you buy petrol, for example, and you go to the gas station and fill your tank, then what you basically acquire when you fill up the tank is you acquire a license to destroy the atmosphere by taking oxygen and turning that into carbon dioxide. And one could, of course, it's reasonable to ask who gave the oil companies the right to sell you this license to destroy the atmosphere. Now, there's another point which is important, and that is if you want to create a carbon dioxide molecule, CO2, you need exactly one carbon atom. Now, the number of carbon atoms on the planet is a constant. We cannot manufacture carbon atoms. They have been produced when the Earth was basically created, actually before that, and they are simply around. We can only decide where we want to put them. Now, so the question is now, where does this carbon come from? With glucose, humans are combustion engines. If I eat sugar, I will use oxygen from the atmosphere and I will produce carbon dioxide. Or if I eat bread, it will basically consist of starch, and that will be turned into glucose eventually and will be burned in my body. So the carbon is coming from a plant, in that case, from wheat, if I eat bread. Now, yes, it's true, I will produce carbon dioxide. The human body produces roughly 300 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year. However, the carbon was taken from a plant, and if I then grow wheat again the next year, exactly the same amount of carbon will be absorbed by the wheat, and therefore there's no way, as long as I eat plants or biomass, biological product, there's no way that this can increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. Thus, the only way, if I really want to produce additional carbon dioxide, I need to take the carbon from a fossil storage, i.e. fossil fuels. So what this means is, of course, the following. As long as we extract fossil fuels from the ground, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will increase. It is as simple as that. Because eventually, even if you use it to make plastic or whatever, at some point this plastic will end up in a waste incinerator, and then it will be burnt, and then the carbon will be released. The carbon atoms cannot be destroyed, they cannot be, well, they're simply there. So that direction is clear. As long as we produce or extract fossil fuel from the ground, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will increase. The opposite is, of course, also true. The moment we stop extracting fossil fuels from the ground, there simply won't be any carbon atoms left to produce carbon dioxide from, meaning that at the instant we stop extracting fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide concentration will stop increasing. So there is a one-to-one correspondence between the extraction of fossil fuels and global warming. Now, some of you might argue that is not entirely true. There is some contribution from land use, etc., and building activities. That is true, but more than 80% of a carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere is simply fossil fuels. Now you can see in this here, I made a plot. So this is the annual increase in carbon dioxide concentration, going from, if you remember, 0.86 at the beginning of the 1960s, end of the 50s, to 2.66 today, increase of carbon dioxide per year. And here you have our annual carbon emissions in gigatons per year. And we can probably agree that there's a pretty good correlation between these two quantities. It's actually, up to a couple of years ago, I used to put a straight line in here, but from now, today, it's actually obvious it's not a straight line anymore, which is quite worrying. Now, even though the carbon emissions, the annual emissions of carbon are constant, the concentration in the atmosphere is increasing faster and faster. There can be two reasons for this. One is, of course, that the reported carbon emissions are actually not true, that people are cheating with their carbon accounting, which wouldn't surprise me the least. The other option is, of course, to say that the Earth is slowly losing its power to absorb, or its ability to absorb carbon out from the atmosphere, because we are burning down forests and destroying natural ecosystems at a shocking rate at the moment. Okay, the result is also quite clear. This is the temperature anomaly. Again, I want to point out there is no modeling involved. The data that I'm using are public. You can go to this link and download it, and then you can plot this yourself. So here's the temperature anomaly, the deviation from the first 30 years. Here I put 30 years as a reference, and these are the deviations. The plus signs are monthly values. The blue line is an average of 12 months, so yearly averages. The red line is an 11-year average, and then I put in a line here for the last 30 years, which I extrapolate to 2 degrees, because I think it would be interesting to see when we hit 2 degrees. Now, there's no rocket science involved. I just want to point out one thing. Up to like the 1970s, it was probably not, I mean, you could argue that the effect of global warming had not yet been seen. There were no clear signal, measurable signal out there. However, since the 70s, early 80s, and remember James Hansen gave his famous testimonial to Congress in 1988. So in the 80s, it was completely clear the temperature of the planet is increasing, and it's increasing a lot. And going back to the 1.5 degree target, so here July 24 was 1.47 degrees too hot. The last 12 months have been 1.57 degrees too hot, so probably we are not going to make the 1.5 degree target. And I must confess, when I show this plot to young people, I really feel bad about it, because the students I talk to typically can reasonably expect to live for another 5 or 6 decades, so 56 years. They're in their 20s, and if I live until they're 80, they will live for another 60 years. And if you extrapolate, so then we're talking about, we are now here, we are talking about someone 2080 something. And if we continue like this, the world will not be a nice place. And by the way, please remember that most of these plots you see about temperature predictions, etc., climate scenarios, they magically end in the year 2100. But there are very many people alive on this planet today who will still be alive in the year 2100. So this is really a problem that will significantly impact a lot of people who are alive on this planet today. Okay, this is something I bet climate scientists will not be happy with me, but I do it anyway, because I had all the data. I allowed myself to plot on this axis simply the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere, and on this plot the temperature anomaly. And again, we see there are lots of oscillations in this temperature anomaly, because yes, there have been El Niños and La Niñas and whatnot, different weather patterns, but the trend, I think, is fairly obvious, that the temperature of our planet is rising as the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is rising. Okay, and of course, I think this is very important to point out. The big oil companies always knew this. So this is the famous paper, well actually it was a memo, a memorandum to the Exxon management about the CO2 greenhouse effect from the year 1982. This hand-drawn plot is from that report, and it has been published online. And you see the upper line here is the, let's see if I can get the laser pointer. The upper line here is the predicted carbon dioxide concentration, and the black line here is a predicted temperature increase. So that's this scale, and the carbon dioxide is here. And if you compare, they published this in the beginning of the 80s. And if you look at it, the blue line here is from this paper, Rahmstorff, Oreskes, etc., and Supran, assessing ExxonMobil global warming projections. And you see that Exxon was extremely good at predicting the 420 ppm that we would reach. And actually, they believed that they would destroy the planet faster than they actually managed to do. The planet was a bit more resilient than they thought, but again, they predicted a temperature of increase of roughly 1 degree centigrade. And well, again, the observed temperature, but again, I think this is is slightly below that. But again, it doesn't matter. It shows that this is not rocket science, or rather the scientists from Exxon were fairly reasonably good. And of course they were, because the big uncertainty in all climate models is the amount of carbon dioxide that will be released into the atmosphere. And of course, who would be better at predicting that than the companies that are actually emitting this carbon dioxide? They were very well positioned to predict the increase of carbon dioxide. Now, so they were good. The problem was they didn't tell us. And of course, this Upton Sinclair quote, which probably most of you have heard many times before: it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding. I think this is a clear explanation. They realized that releasing this information would be really bad for business, and thus they kept quiet about it. Or rather, they didn't even do that. They were even worse. They actually started a disinformation campaign to sort of make people believe that there were doubts about climate science. Okay, so here is another plot which I think is quite interesting. This is global energy demand of the world going up to 2023, and you see the problem. We have oil, we have coal, we have gas, we have some nuclear, we have some hydro, and then we have renewables. And yes, the good news is that the renewables are increasing on relative terms way faster than the others. However, the total global energy demand is increasing faster than we can build renewables, meaning that we have not yet reached the stage where we're actually replacing fossil fuels with renewables. We are meaning that the demand for fossil fuels is still increasing. And the total, I think it's roughly about 82%. 82% of global energy demand is provided by fossil fuels still. And this is of course a problem that, and I will come back to this point, if we want to replace fossil fuels by installing renewables, we somehow implicitly assume that there's an upper limit to the amount of energy we can use. So far, this has not been true. We have basically added even more energy by installing renewables, but still the demand for fossil fuels is increasing. Okay, so many years ago I made this plot. I think it's still quite funny, so I show it. This is the hoping for a miracle is not a strategy plot. What I plotted here is the black line with the round dots is carbon dioxide data, historic data from, I think I took 1975 until 2023, I guess. And the red curve with the plus signs, the solid red curve with plus signs, is GDP, so global gross domestic product globally for the world. And you see there's a close correlation between these two. I think it's interesting to see that this was the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, both curves dropped. Then of course here we had COVID, 2020, both curves dropped. Other than that, they have been closely connected. Now, if you look at climate policies of the world today, the nations of the world, G20, whatever, are still convinced that we need the economic growth to continue. This is basically continuing the growth we had in the past, which is roughly 3% per year globally. On the other hand, they have also signed like the Paris Agreement that tells us that we should have the carbon emissions should drop like this. Because, and this is a famous quote from President George H.W. Bush, 1992, the Earth Summit, or in the meeting in Rio de Janeiro, where he arrived at the meeting telling the world that the American lifestyle is non-negotiable, i.e. we need this growth. And the problem is, of course, that there is no technology that will make this happen. Just that we're clear about that. This is not possible with today's technology, and it's also not, we don't know of any technology that will make this happen. So any sane person in the room will realize that this, which is the official climate policy, will never materialize. I personally don't believe that we can lower carbon emissions this fast, and we can certainly not do it if we allow emissions to go up like this. So the truth will be somewhere in the middle. Some decoupling of these curves is certainly possible, but not fast enough. So we should be talking about future scenarios with basically zero or even negative growth and some drop in carbon emissions. Anyway, and just to make this point completely clear, exponential growth is of course ridiculous. No one who knows anything about anything believes in economic growth. I really like these videos. I would like to show this because it explains it all. It's taken from a movie or film you can find on YouTube called There Is No Tomorrow. Here's the link. So, but it speaks for itself.
These bacteria live in a bottle. Their population doubles every minute. At 11 AM, there is one bacterium. At 12 noon, the bottle is full. It is half full at 11:59, leaving only enough space for one more doubling. The bacteria see the danger. They search for new bottles and find 3. They assume that their problem is solved. By 12 noon, the first bottle is full. By 12:01, the second bottle is full. By 12:02, all the bottles are full. This is the problem that we face due to the doubling caused by exponential growth.
So, anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. That quote is not from me, but from Kenneth E. Boulding. But it is true, of course. I always tell my students that in any science or technology, like be it physics, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chemistry, whatever, exponential growth is what is referred to as an instability. If something in your system starts growing exponentially, then you're out of luck. I mean, the whole thing will crash. And only the economists have had this great idea of referring to that as stable growth. And that's, of course, just silly. Anyway, from this, I hope you agree with me now that the solution to our problem is obvious. First, we need to keep as much fossil fuel as possible in the ground, meaning that we need to stop extracting fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Why? Because renewable energies, this will not happen if we build renewable energies. I mean, we need to build renewable energy sources anyway, but they don't reduce the demand for fossil fuels because the demand for energy is unlimited. Also, we know that carbon capture doesn't work. It's not a realistic option, i.e. if we want to stop climate change, we need to stop fossil fuel extraction. Now, I'm actually going to quote Darren Woods here, the CEO of Exxon. There was a long interview with him, I think by Fortune magazine, you can find it on YouTube, where he points out that the climate crisis is a demand problem, it's not a supply problem. As long as there's demand for fossil fuels, the oil companies will produce it. And I agree with these points that there's no sense to go after the oil companies if the society is completely dependent on fossil fuels. We can't simply, and the oil companies know that. If they know that if the supply of oil goes down, if not enough oil is produced, or if not enough fossil fuels are being produced, then energy prices rise and people get very upset, and basically the first thing that happens is that the government loses the next election. They know that very well. Now, the problem is that renewable energies, it's not that renewable energies are too expensive, but that fossil fuels are too cheap. Now, this is a very important point because it means the problem cannot be solved by science and technology. There's no way science and technology will make fossil fuels more expensive, i.e. it is a political problem. And we need a political decision to increase artificially, if you want, increase the price of fossil fuels. The good news is we don't need a world government for this, I'm convinced. We have a market economy, and the market economy can be used to solve this problem. Capitalism cannot be used to solve the problem. First, I want to emphasize, market economy, a free market has nothing to do with capitalism, and capitalism has nothing to do with a free market. Markets are way older than capitalism, and what I'm talking here about the market economy. The capitalism, we don't have to abolish it. It will die anyway if we introduce this plan. Now, so how do you solve problems without the world government? You do it using feedback loops. And feedback loops, many of you probably know about it, but just to give you an example here, this is if you want to heat the house, if you want to have a convenient or a comfortable temperature inside this house, you need to heat it. And the problem is, how much heat do you need? It's not possible to predict this. You don't know in advance what the temperature will be outside. You don't know how many people will be inside the house. You don't know if the windows are open or closed. You don't know if the door is open or closed, i.e. this is an impossible problem to solve. It's not possible to predict. It's not that we don't know it at the moment. It is not possible to know how much heat we will need for this house. So what do engineers do in this case? And this is not, nature does it all the time. So, this is something where we have basically taken over from from nature. You introduce a feedback loop, and in this case, it's a negative feedback loop. So you put in a thermostat, and it's basically a device. It measures the temperature inside. If it's too hot inside, you don't heat, and if it's too cold inside, you heat, and thereby you solve the problem. And these feedback loops can be found everywhere. And the drones, these quadrocopters that are flying around everywhere, they wouldn't work without the feedback loop. Because you have to constantly adjust the speed of the 4 engines so that you stabilize the drone, and this is done by a small microprocessor that basically implements a feedback loop. Capitalism is a feedback loop because it's a positive feedback loop because it gives money to the people who have money already, and that leads to exponential growth. Socialism, in a way, is a negative feedback loop because it takes away money from the people who have a lot of money and give it to the rest, which stabilizes the system, but doesn't create exponential growth. Anyway, so now, with this in mind, what do we need to accomplish? And here is the point where I think the environmental movement has been missing out. So we want to save the planet. And we know that one of the things we need to do is to stop extracting fossil fuel, get rid of fossil fuels. Now, one of the problems we have is the tragedy of the commons. This is a classical problem. Of course, if you treat the atmosphere in this case as a commons, we know what is happening. People are allowed to pollute and destroy the atmosphere without paying for it. This is the definition of a tragedy of the commons. So we have to fix that. Now, in this case, it's almost trivial to solve because we know that it's being done using fossil fuels. If we don't have fossil fuels, it's impossible to produce carbon dioxide. Thus, if we put the price on fossil fuels, we will have solved this problem. Next problem, the prisoner's dilemma. Of course, fossil fuels are very useful, especially if you want to build an army or fight wars, etc. So it's kind of an disarmament problem we are facing here. No country is prepared to de-industrialize or reduce its industrial competitiveness without the other countries doing it too. So whatever we do, we need a system that is enforceable, and it is enforceable on a global scale. It's not possible in today's world for one country to decarbonize and become green if others are not doing the same. Or put differently, what's the point of building a green utopia if the next day you're being invaded by a belligerent army from your neighboring country? This is not what you want to have. We also need climate justice because, I will talk more about this in a while, We cannot have a system where some countries are really wasting far more resources and fossil fuels than others. This is not going to be a peaceful world. And we need a democracy. After all, we need, and that goes together with climate justice, we need a solution that helps as many people as possible. Okay, now, how do we do this? It's surprisingly simple. First, the advantage we have is that there's a very small number of fossil fuel producers in the world. There are some couple of hundreds of them. I think the carbon majors, there are 70 carbon majors, and they are responsible for, I don't know, 80-90% of production. Don't quote me on the numbers, but it's a small number of companies producing all the fossil fuels. Now, they know exactly how much they produce. So if Shell, for example, produces 1 barrel of oil, we know exactly how much carbon is in this barrel of oil, and Shell knows it too. So why don't we simply require from them to pay a fee proportional to the amount of carbon in this barrel of oil to Global Fund? It's no administrative effort for them. They know exactly how much they produce. They can simply pay it to fund. And of course, they're not going to pay it out of their own pocket. They are going to simply raise the price. So they're going to say, okay, fine. They act as tax collectors. I pay this to the I pay the fee to Global Fund, and I increase the price of a barrel of oil accordingly, so I get my money anyway, and I'm happy. Why should I be worried about that? Now, then we take the money from the fund and we distribute that among the world's nations, and we do this on a per capita basis. And I will show you that would basically immediately abolish poverty in the world, meaning that we would have plenty of money to make sure that every person in the world can be fed. And the good thing about it is there's only one thing we need to agree on. This is an algorithm. There's nothing to be discussed here. We know how much carbon the fossil fuel companies produce. We know the population of the world's countries. So this taxing and redistribution scheme doesn't involve any decision. It's completely simple. And as I told you, it's a very small number of players. We have a couple of hundred fossil fuel companies. We have like roughly 200 nations in the world. So it's a system that only involves like 500 parties or something, or less than 500. And the only thing we need to agree on is the price on carbon emissions. How much should we charge for 1 ton of carbon dioxide? And that's basically the idea behind global climate compensation. Now, it might actually work. As I told you, the fossil fuel companies act as tax collectors. I don't think I've talked to people from fossil fuel companies and they basically agree, well, if the rules are the same for everyone, why should we mind? I mean, it's no problem. And actually, Darren Woods from Exxon, one of the questions he got in this interview was, I mean, he makes the point which he is unfortunately right about, that there's no way with current policies to reach net zero by 2050. And then he got like the follow-up question, how could we change that? And he said, well, the only hope he sees is a carbon tax. So I mean, the oil companies understand that these carbon taxes will actually work, but if you put the same fee on every company, then why should they bother about it? And they would pass on the higher cost to the customers. So the cost will pass on to the customers. This is good because it means that we are not punishing the oil companies, we are punishing the entire fossil fuel-based value chain. So it will always be, for example, if you have a manufacturer in a company producing some consumer goods in China, okay, they will now also pay more for fossil fuel or for the energy. And again, they will pass on the cost to the customers, so they will sell the product they sell from, in this case China, will now be a bit more expensive. And it of course will always be the end user that pays. The person who cannot pass on the cost to the next guy because he is actually using the energy himself, he will have to pay it. What it means, of course, that some business models that are strongly dependent on fossil fuels will be invalidated, because flying, if the price of flying really increases a lot less people will fly. Or put differently, the profits resulting from fossil fuels. If you have a product that only works because of fossil fuels, all the profits you will make from this product will be socialized basically and distributed equitably among the world's population. It would obviously mean that renewable energies would become way more attractive because they produce less carbon dioxide. And in the end, consumers would pay, unless, of course, the product you are using that you bought can be recycled. So this would be an enormous boost for renewable energies, but it will also be a boost for the circular economy. It requires zero regulation, zero administration or red tape. As I told you, the fossil fuel companies are the tax collectors, and everything can be handled very easily. So the only thing you would understand or you would see as a normal consumer is that prices, especially of fossil fuels, will increase. This is an important point. Many companies today claim that they are carbon neutral or net zero. Well, the proof is in the pudding. If they are actually carbon neutral, then it means that they would not have any problems with the global climate compensation, because if there are net zero, their prices will not increase. There are no loopholes in this plan. The billionaire living in the Cayman Islands with his yacht and his private jet will also have to pay this tax, because there's no way you can buy fossil fuel or oil in that case, or kerosene, without paying this tax, because it has been taken out already when the fossil fuel was extracted from the ground. And as I will show you, and I think this is a very important point, more than 80% of the world population would immediately benefit from this scheme. So if the world were a democracy, then this would be a no-brainer. Quick calculations. Let's just, for the fun of it, take $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. I have no idea if that's realistic, but let's do the calculation. We have roughly, from fossil fuels, 36 gigatons of emissions per year, so we would get $3,600 billion or $3.6 trillion annually to this fund. The price of a barrel of oil, just the carbon content, would increase by $42. That's a lot, but still, I mean, there are oscillations in the price of oil, so it's a significant increase. This would put 30 cents per liter of oil. The money would be enough to give every person on this planet a yearly income of $450, or roughly $38 per month. So every human being on Earth could get $38 per month. This is not very much in Switzerland, where I live, or in the United States. However, I would guess that for countries like Sudan, Bangladesh, etc., that would be a significant improvement, and that in this case, this would more or less abolish global poverty. Now let's compare this. So global GDP is roughly $100 trillion compared to 3.6, so we are talking about 3.6% of global GDP. Global defense spending today is roughly at $2.4 trillion. So it's the same order of magnitude. Fossil fuel subsidies to the fossil fuel industry is roughly direct subsidies. I think this was 2022, if I'm not mistaken, was $1.3 trillion. If you include indirect subsidies like external costs that they don't have to pay for the oil companies, then the total number is $7 trillion. So it's more than it's roughly twice of what we have here. And of course, lost tax revenue from tax havens, roughly $500 billion per year. Now, if it's that simple, why hasn't this been done long ago? There's a very simple answer to that. I made these three plots. I think they're very useful. Again, the data are publicly available. You go to the World Bank, you download 3 spreadsheets, and then you can make this plot. I divided the world's population into 3 parts. And again, there might be some small round-off errors in these numbers, but that is not the important point here. The important point is the big picture. So look at the population of the world. The global north is roughly, it's less than 14%. Then we have the BRICS countries. So these are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others. The number of BRICS countries is increasing. Anyway, 45% of the world population. And then we have like the rest, 41%. Now look at global GDP. It looks a bit different. So the less than 14% in global north have more than 56% of global GDP. And then, well, you get the picture. Anyway, that means that the guys living in the global north consume a lot more resources than they need, not only energy, also other resources. The global north relies on having a constant flow of raw materials and products and stuff from the rest of the world, and we also dispose of most of our waste in poorer countries. A lot of textile waste is sent to Africa, also electronics, etc. So we are basically consuming the planet here in the global north, or contributing the most to the destruction of the world. So now you can ask yourself, why on earth does the rest of the world accept this? And in order to understand that, you simply have to look at the military spending, and you see that almost 2/3 of the world's military spending is the global north. So basically, the resources that we are taking from the rest of the world to enable our lifestyle in the north, to a large extent, is actually extracted at gunpoint. And I mean, this was always the case. I mean, this was the whole point of colonialism, and it turns out not that much has changed. Now, why is this problematic for the global north? Well, I made a small calculation here, and again, this is a very rough estimate. So the point with global climate compensation is that there will be a global fossil fuel tax. The money will be paid into a fund, and then every country will receive money from the fund proportional to the population. So every per capita we get the same amount. Now, if we now assume, and this is a rough estimate here, that the fossil fuel consumption, the consumption of a country is proportional to GDP, then this number is proportional to the GDP of a country, and this is proportional to population. Now, as I said before, the total inflow to the fund will be $3,600 billion. This would be enough to give every person in the world a universal basic income of perhaps $450. Now, where does this money come from? Well, if you take the net contributions, the global north would pay in a lot because we use a lot of fossil fuels, use a lot of energy, and we will get something back. But the global north will be a net contributor to this fund with roughly $1.5 trillion. The other groups, the BRICS countries and the rest, would be net benefactors because they have a smaller carbon footprint per capita, so they would actually, their costs would also increase. They would pay the same fossil fuel tax as everyone else, but their carbon footprint is so small per capita, and the payout per capita would be the same for all countries, so they would receive a lot of money. And this is of course a basic problem. If you introduce a polluters pay principle, it means that the polluters will actually pay if it's reasonable. The global north has caused most of the problems in the world, and fixing them will cost a lot of money. Now, why should the global north agree on this? Well, because the alternative is even worse. So this study was done by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and it basically puts the economic loss from global climate change at $38 trillion per year. And I was talking about $3.6 trillion per year. So the point is, yes, it will get nasty out there, and the costs from climate change will be way higher than the costs of averting the problem. However, you see the problem here, the global north, well, United States is not looking too good, and Australia is looking really horrible. The problem is, of course, that many other northern countries actually are in a position where they won't suffer that much from climate change. But nonetheless, I think that's a very stupid thing to look at the problem, a stupid way of looking at the problem, because I don't think when the global world order collapses, it's very unlikely that we will have that we won't see a lot of wars. Anyway, just to sort of back this up, I found some reports here. This is a very new study about To a Just World on a Safe Planet. It shows that we need a just world in order to be able to save the planet without significant redistribution. Without the global north being prepared to pay for the damage it has done, it won't be possible. And of course, the flow of money and resources from the global north from the global south, from poorer countries to the rich countries in the north, has been well documented in many studies. I like this number. Some 100, we actually owe the global north owes the rest of the world $170 trillion for excessive CO2 emissions. And compared to that number, the global climate compensation with paying some 1.5 trillion per year thus sounds fairly reasonable. Anyway, I believe this is a very reasonable solution, and I believe that for another reason too. We are currently conducting an uncontrolled, irreversible, high-risk experiment with the only habitable planet in the known universe. What I'm suggesting is, why don't we introduce a carbon tax, which would be equivalent to conducting a controlled, reversible, risk-free experiment with the economic system? I mean, what's the risk? We introduce this, if you don't like $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, let's start with 25. That wouldn't be a problem at all. And see what happens. It's so trivial to set up. It's completely simple, because we don't have to tax all the people, all companies. We only have to go to the couple of hundred carbon or the fossil fuel companies and to the governments. They can decide this among themselves, and then we have actually put in place a controlled, reversible, risk-free experiment. Because if it turns out that the cost of introducing this carbon tax is too high, then of course we can lower the tax. Now, and we need this experiment because currently we are discussing, the discussions are completely absurd. Everyone knows that we need to stop using fossil fuels, but we don't know how quickly it can be done. I don't know it either. This is really, but that's the point. Why don't we introduce such a tax, and then we will see how fast it can be done? So this is, in the true scientific sense of a world, a full-scale experiment. If decoupling is possible, and I'm in no way want to exclude that. I personally don't believe it, but I'm fine with it. If decoupling is possible, then if we introduce a fossil fuel tax, this will accelerate decoupling. And fine, I can live with that. I have no problems with it. However, if decoupling is not possible, then the introduction of global carbon compensation will lead to degrowth, because simply it will be impossible to make a profit from fossil fuels, and if you can't make profit without fossil fuels, then we won't have profits. Another good thing about it is this is a truly global deal. It's a fair deal, and it's a global deal, and it would actually encourage global collaboration and reduce global tensions. And again, I want to point out, if the world were a democracy, this suggestion would have been implemented long ago. And I recently came across this quote by Kurt Vonnegut: "We could have saved the earth, but we were too damn cheap." And I recently also wrote a post about this, pointing out the problem we have here, that the global north, we simply don't. We created the mess, and as long as we refuse to pay for it, it will be very difficult to solve our problems. This was always the problems with the climate, the United Nations climate conferences, etc. Now, I really like this cartoon. I found this many years ago. It's one of the first cartoons I started to use in my lectures. Research concludes we are destroying Earth. And the response from the government is, could you kindly rephrase that in equivocal, inaccurate, vague, self-serving and roundabout terms that we can all understand? That is basically it. The message from science is completely clear, but the rest of society, politicians, private sector do not really want to hear that, so they always come back to science and try to get a different answer. And I came up with this idea. I think it's not very clever, but it shows basically the point. Richard Feynman, 1986, made this very famous observation: for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Now, the role of science is to identify the parameter space of physically viable solutions with any problem, if it's a pandemic or if it's a climate crisis, energy crisis, whatever. The role of scientists is basically, or should be, to try to find out what is physically possible. Now, governments didn't like this. On the other hand, we have a so-called Overton window, which is basically a parameter space of acceptable government policies, or policies that we want to accept. And the problem we have been having in the climate debate is, of course, that there are no overlap between these sets. The intersection of these two sets is an empty set. Now, for political convenience, we have now been trying for more than 30 years to invest in research to move this set closer to what is politically acceptable. And there has been some progress, but basically this set has refused to budge. So my argument is that we probably have to start moving the Overton window. If we want to solve this problem, we really need to move politics instead, and to get some sort of intersection between what is physically possible and what is politically achievable. And my argument is that global climate compensation would be a perfect fit. Once we are prepared to move politics a bit, we would actually have a solution that would be extremely powerful, would have an enormous impact on the world, because after all, we know that the market economy works. If we increase the price of fossil fuels, then every 8 billion people in the world would suddenly become inventors, because they would try to find ways of lowering their energy bills, and that is what we want to achieve. However, we cannot do that without redistribution, because I completely agree, many people in the world are very poor. They cannot tolerate, they cannot accept higher prices for food, etc. And this was always, of course, the killer argument from the oil industry. They were always saying, well, we need to produce oil because this is the only way we can feed poorer people. Global climate compensation cuts through this problem by simply saying, well, that's fine, so let's redistribute some money so that the really poor people will get so much money out from this fund that they will actually have a better life once we introduce this carbon tax. Now, and with this I'm finished. I found this quote from St. Augustine. Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. It's a beautiful quote. I'm personally extremely angry with the way things are. I think it's a scandal, it's an outrage what we are doing to our planet. And we are doing it just to keep a small number of very rich people very happy. Well, actually, they're not even happy. I think they're very unhappy. you can't buy happiness. But anyway, they're basically addicted to money, and this is why they want to earn even more, and we need to change that. But then requires some courage, because yes, if we introduce such a carbon tax, many large profitable companies would see their profits shrink, and they would not be happy with that. But anyway, I think this is one of the few realistic ideas out there that does not only address the problem of how do we get people to reduce their consumption, how do we install more renewable energy sources, but also takes care of the global political inequalities that we have out there, and try to come up with a solution which everyone can contribute to. And I honestly believe that we really have to understand that many people are lying to us in the energy debate. There's an enormous amount of greenwashing and propaganda out there. People trying to shift the blame, like carbon capture. This is of course an obvious attempt of the oil industry, fossil fuel industry, to remain relevant, because they realize that if you cannot if you cannot claim that you can sort of capture and store the carbon dioxide, then of course there is no future for fossil fuels. But the truth of the matter is you cannot capture and store carbon dioxide. It's simply not possible. Anyway, so once we cut through the BS, the greenwashing and the propaganda, I think there is a simple choice here. We have to do the right thing. And yes, doing the right thing will mean that initially at least a lot of money will flow from the global north to the global south. But that's the point. We caused the problem, we created the problem, we have gotten extremely rich from fossil fuels. We have caused the problem of climate change and a bunch of other problems. And if we refuse to pay for the damage we did, I see very little hope that we can solve our problem. And if you like this idea, feel free to contact me. We need more people to promote the idea that there is a simple solution out there, or at least an obvious one. Thanks a lot.